Years ago, I went to Shalom Mountain in the Catskills. It's a sort of a meditative and therapeutic retreat. And I went there for a 4-day retreat. I believe this was for elders, and I qualified. On the first day, about 25 or 30 people there. We met in a large room, and we all a big circle. And we took turns spending maybe 3 or 4 minutes talking about our lives and our stories. When it came my turn, I gave a little brief history of my life, I guess. But it mostly talked about how I felt even hours away from Woodstock, here in the Catskills, how I still felt connected and supported by my North Chapel community. I didn't think of this as being anything particularly unusual, but I talked about our community and the things we did together and how we supported one another. And then other people went on and told their stories, and afterwards, I cannot tell you how many people came up to me and said, "You have a community like that? I can't believe it. Apparently this is much more unique than we realize." And I worry that we sometimes take it for granted. We think everybody has a community of this sort, and that's not the case. And a community, as strong as it is in many ways, it's also fragile and needs our support in any possible way we can provide it. And on that note, the collection will be taken. Thank you very much.
Sometimes I get up in the morning and I go to play guitar. I often go to Silver Lake, right here in Barnard. When I can't get there, hopefully it's because I'm on Star Island. And I go to the front porch and I play guitar. And I was playing my slide guitar 2 days ago when a lovely seagull blessed my guitar. Yeah. That one. So after some unfortunate cursing, there was resilience. The strangest thought came to me on this morning as I awake to meet the coming dawn. The sun was hardly peeking through the garden, and it felt that with everything I was one, and then I wished that I could come back as a flower. Stevie Wonder. The blues teaches us otherwise, right? It's not nearly as optimistic, especially when it comes to issues like heartache and heartbreak. The blues remind us that I'd rather be blind, crippled, and crazy, and somewhere pushing up a daisy, you know what that means, right? Than to let you break my heart all over again. That's the blues. Stevie Wonder is blind, but he is not crippled and crazy. A great light shines within him, and he's more resilient than most of us. He doesn't want to lie beneath the ground and push up daisies. He wants us all to become the flowers in full bloom. Good morning. It's good to be together. I find this passage to be a particularly good example of resilience, but unfortunately for me, I'm not feeling particularly resilient these days. In fact, I feel like the opposite of resilience. I feel as resilient as new clay. Right? Rubber is resilient. It springs back into shape. Clay is quite the opposite, right? It retains the shape of that which is pressed upon it. I like clay. It soothes me. Years ago, I considered becoming a potter. There was a good month in the 1980s when I thought about turning away from ministry and from music and really getting into clay. My friend Martha was helpful to me. She told me where I could take classes. She shared her experience as a potter, wedging the clay to remove its bubbles, because air can get trapped in the clay and ruin the outcome of a creative effort. So you have to wedge the clay, you have to knead it like a heavy dough. That's the very first step in the process. You wedge the clay to prepare it for the turning wheel. And once it's on the turning wheel, you have to center it, and you have to center yourself. At this point, with water and with temerity and with a little skill, you can open the clay with your index finger as the wheel is spinning. And then you can throw the pot. You gently bring your clay into creation. You bring a pot into being. It's a beautiful process, and it takes a while, but it's really gorgeous to watch if you're patient enough, if you have the time. Once the pot comes into being, you can cut it from the wheel with a wire, and then you can let it dry for a while naturally. And then you can glaze it, and then fire it in a kiln under heavy and high heat. This clay is in the slow process of transformation. It's in a multi-phase process of hardening and of toughening up. And in the beginning, of course, the clay is quite malleable. You work it best with water and it softens, but then it dries quickly as the water evaporates. After the clay is wedged and centered, open, and thrown into being, the drying process begins, slowly at first, until the final phase, of course, when the clay goes into the kiln, when the clay dries and hardens, this time very quickly and under fire. Has anybody ever done this? It's a beautiful process. At no point along the way is the clay truly resilient. So it's not a good model for us today. In this late summer month of August, we've been exploring the theme of resilience, so it may seem odd or even antithetical to be talking about clay. Clay does not bounce back. It doesn't bounce at all, right? It lands on the ground like a thud and doesn't do anything. It holds the shape of that which is impressed upon it. It's not resilient in any way. It is the opposite of resilient, which is how I feel right now. If you threw me on the ground, I would not bounce. I would splat and retain the shape of the floor. I feel like the opposite of resilient. I feel precisely as resilient as new clay. As I endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and life these days, I'm not feeling particularly resilient, not after hearing the news from Afghanistan and how desperate things are and have become over there, how desperate we all are for what has taken place since 9/11. I don't feel particularly resilient after a long, hard year and more of COVID and then the vaccine controversies. And now the new variants, Delta and Lambda, I'm not feeling resistant. I'm feeling the slings and arrows, and they've left their impression on me. Slings and arrows is Shakespeare's poetry, right? It comes from his most famous part of Hamlet, when the young prince muses to be or not to be, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or take arms against a sea of trouble and by opposing end them. To take arms against the sea, that sounds more like resilience to me. That sounds like bouncing back against adversity and taking it on. That sounds like something that we should be talking about as we explore our theme, because, the worship team worked really hard to develop this theme, and I am about to disappoint them. Which worries me a little bit, because they look like very nice people. But we meet in a closed room. Working together so honestly and so earnestly in compassionate reflection, it's an honor to be part of that team. They put together a theme that we should be exploring this morning, the concept of resilience, and they wrote, as Richard shared earlier, an uprooted plant can be set into a soft bed of soil, watered and given sunshine. In time, its wilted leaves may revive and grow new shoots past the broken stems, and bloom even in its harried state. Those roots can hold and find nourishment in a new place. We fall down. We seek to get up. One can develop strength in the midst of challenge. We seek resources within ourselves, but it is often our strong and supportive relationships that help us to find the good way forward. My guiding image this morning is not an uprooted plant, it is the clay, the mud from which that plant rises. I thought about choosing a different image, but I was tired and I was in a mood. And a seagull had blessed my guitar. I wasn't happy. I didn't have the energy that it takes against a sea of troubles to shoulder on. I just wanted to walk away. The sea can be troubled without me for a while, I figured. I can't always respond to its troubles, to its tidal urgencies. I can't correct for the nature of the world, for the pull of moon on tides. That's not what resilience is anyway, not really. Not all the time. Sometimes resilience is getting ready to bounce back, not just bouncing back itself. New clay is about getting ready. In seminary, they called what I'm trying to do now preaching against the text, turning things around to see what happens. At the same time, I don't want to be dishonest. I don't want to stand before you with false enthusiasm, not at this moment in the world. I want to discover the meaning of resilience in a brand new way, in an unlikely way, in an uncommon way. And if we are lucky, we'll find an inverse usefulness to the metaphor. Now, new clay is not resilience, and neither am I sometimes. I'm not an eternal optimist. I don't always have enough energy to look on the bright side of things. I don't always spring back to life with vim and vigor. I regularly require substantial amounts of caffeine. I often am toppled over by life, wounded by it, enraged by it, defeated by it. I'm not always up for resilience. I'm not always into bouncing back. The Bible says that you and I are fashioned out of clay. The psalmists say that clay symbolizes what our lives are like before we are saved. In the book of Bob Dylan, which I believe is in the Apocrypha, there's a song called Joey in which the following is written. Larry was the oldest, Joey was next to last. They called Joey crazy. The baby they called Kid Blast. Some say they lived off gambling and running numbers too. It always seemed that they got caught in between the mob and the men in blue. Joey, Joey, king of the streets, child of clay. The version of the song that I heard was recorded when Bob Dylan was still playing with the Grateful Dead. It was quite beautiful. And then there's the story that appears in the Gospel of John. As he walked along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth, and his disciple asked him, "Hey, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he is born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither the man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." Jesus said, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he said this, he spat upon the ground and made mud, which is translated as clay in the King James Version. And Jesus spread this mud, this clay, on the blind man's eyes, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And he went and washed, and he came back able to see. Now, I can't help but wonder if this clay, this mud, that was spread upon and then washed from the eyes of Stevie Wonder was actually the clay and the mud of music, of songs in the key of life, as he might say. A beautiful response to adversity, a great example of resilience. It seems fair and reasonable and real to suggest that through his artistry, Stevie Wonder gives great gift and great light to the world. Music is his light, and through our singing is ours as well. This is powerful clay. This is what he is. This is what we are. We are powerful clay. It has been true for some time, and the story that comes to mind most powerfully goes back to Star Island. As you may know, I just got back from a 6-day conference at Star Island. Or for those of you who may not know, Star Island is a camp and a conference center that's located 10 miles off the coast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It's jointly owned and cared for by the Unitarian Universalist Association and by the United Church of Christ. For the last 6 days, I almost said 6 years. It's been a long summer and it's really hot. For the past 6 days, I led a workshop on storytelling, and Gabe was on island, and so was his sister, Julia. Julia was just visiting. She was not out there for the whole summer like her brother was, so she wasn't as well known. She walked around with a name tag that said Gabe's sister, and we called her that instead of Julia. Gabe has been out there since mid-May. I've been going out to Star Island ever since I was a kid and since I was their age. 7, 8 years now. No, I'm just kidding. Close to 37 years now. In fact, before Gabe and Julia were even born or even imagined, I led a workshop on Star Island on leadership. And Gabe and Julia's mother, Beth Ross, was in that workshop. I just saw Beth a few days ago. In that workshop that I led back then, we read poetry together, we considered the lives of artists, we asked brave questions of ourselves and one another, and we played with some really powerful clay. We did an exercise that I will never forget. The workshop met in a place called the Stone Village in the center of the island, in its belly. We met in a lovely little cottage called Vaughan Cottage. The day before the exercise, I asked everyone to come in clothes that they could get dirty. And they also asked that they bring a blindfold with them, one that was comfortable enough so that it could be worn for perhaps the duration of the whole workshop, if need be. And they did, without question, which was good because I would not have answered their questions if they had asked. On the day of the exercise, they arrived and we sat on the floor in a circle, as we always had. We began soon after they were settled and quiet. I said, "Please, get ready to put your blindfolds on. We will do so as soon as I explain the rules." And everyone got ready. And I said, "This is an exercise that happens in silence. There won't be any talking. I will play some music on occasion. You can ask for water when you need to by extending your arm, opening your hands, and cupping your fingers like this. And I will come around as soon as possible and place water in the palm of your hand." You realize right now the participants don't know that this exercise has anything to do with clay. Okay, so they're trying to figure out how they're going to drink water that's cupped in the palm of their hands. So they're chuckling and knowing that they're going to spill it. So I showed them how to ask for the water that would be required, and it was obvious. It was an obvious analogy for asking for the help that we might need in life. It was something that we had been covering earlier in the week in the workshop. Then I let them know that there would be no further instructions, none that were spoken to them at any rate, although they would receive direction in other ways. And I said, "Now is the time to put on your blindfolds," and they did. Audibly, I tore off as many sheets of newsprint as there were students. That's the sound that they heard. As many pieces of newsprint as there were students on the floor, and I set each piece of newsprint down in front of the students, guiding their hands so they knew where it was and they could visualize where it was placed before them. Then, just as audibly, I delivered a softball-size portion of clay to every person dropped from the height of about 4.5 feet. Thud, thud, thud. And they began to handle the clay immediately. Some were smiling, others were not. Each quickly realizing, extending their arms, opening their hands, and cupping their fingers would enable them to better mold the clay that they had received. We sat there molding clay for about 35 or 40 minutes. It felt much longer because they didn't know what was happening and they didn't know when the exercise would end. We just made stuff in each other's company, unbeknownst to one another. We made bowls and cubes and balls and cylinders at first, and then these things developed into more complicated objects. I began to take a stronger lead and became more instructional. I gave clear warning signs. I let them know that the creative period was coming to a close. And when it did, I asked them to place the clay directly before them and to gently remove their blindfolds, taking care to look only at what they had created themselves, non-judgmentally. Non-judgmentally. And they did. And then we had a little parade. I asked them to follow me in silence from the stone village in the center of the island over the path that leads up by the chapel to the left and down onto the front lawn of the hotel. The hotel has a long porch in front of it, and it has a line of rocking chairs that look out towards the water. So there are people sitting there at all times of day and night. And there were people sitting there at that time taking in the view. We would plainly be in their sights. On the front lawn, before the eyes of many, we sat in a circle once again. The circle was much broader this time. We had a longer diameter, higher circumference. We had a lot more room to spread out this time. This time, the instructions were different. We would go in turns, one at a time. When it was our turn to be the shower of our new clay works of art, the instructions were to stand and then to walk around the inside of the circle, showing our creation with care to everyone else in the workshop. Everyone but the shower was careful to study the clay that they were being shown, imagining how their bodies might take the form of what they were seeing. Once the shower had shown everyone and gone all the way around the circle, the shower was to place their clay back in the place where they had been sitting and walk into the center of the circle and embody their clay creation that they had made. This way, everyone could see how the shaper of the clay saw what they had created. Following this, and with the shower still in the center of the circle, everyone else assumed the shape of what they had seen. This way, the shaper of the clay, the creator of the piece, could see themselves reflected through the medium of the clay itself, in the bodies and in the lives of everyone in the circle. The second to last step was placing the clay creation on my old cable sweater, on this old cable sweater, actually. Our clay had to be touching at least one other piece of clay or the sweater itself. Once everyone had done this, we could move on to the final step. And in the same order that we'd placed the clay on my old sweater, going around the circle for the last time, we embodied the shape of our own pieces of clay and became a living, breathing sculpture on the front lawn, right there in front of everybody. I was laying beneath the whole thing on my back, embodying my sweater. I can't explain to you how or why, but being in that clay sculpture that day, that living sculpture that was our bodies, that was our lives, embodying what we had just shaped and brought into being was one of the most joyful and joy-filled experiences of my life. It was rejuvenating and exhilarating. It was like the joy of life sprung right up from the earth in full bloom. Rachel had made a tree. Mark had broken his clay into hundreds of tiny pieces. In that moment, and still now looking back, we all felt so connected. We all felt like we belonged, that we were honest with ourselves and with one another. It was just like what Stevie Wonder said. The strangest thought came to me on this morning when I arose to meet the coming dawn. The sun was hardly peeking through the garden, and it felt that with everything I was one. We are the earth. The earth is us. We are all so deeply connected at that point, we felt. And even more importantly, we were not afraid. In the book of Bob Dylan, later in the work, there are many passages about being deeply connected and unafraid. The one that comes to mind right now is the one about the bomb shelters, the ones that we constructed wherein we could escape the immediate effects of nuclear war. Bob Dylan wrote, "Let me drink from the waters where the mountain streams flood. Let me smell the wildflowers flow free through my blood. Let me sleep in your meadows with green grassy leaves. Let me walk down the road with my brother in peace. Let me die in my footsteps before I go down under the ground." He didn't want to retreat into the ground for an imagined sense of safety. He was more brave than that. He wanted to face life squarely. He wanted to look fear right in the eye without flinching. The clay of the earth from which we have been crafted, as some believe, this clay is not protective of life in the poetry. It is generative of life. Like another poet wrote, "When my time comes around, lay me gently in the cold dark earth. No grave can hold my body down. The clay of the earth is generative of life," genuinely, profoundly even. And the clay of this good earth is resilient. In its own way, it brings us back to life. So when we are broken and tired and weary from the world, and all is heavy, remember to be the light and to be the flower. Let's let the clay return us to the world of the living, carefully showing our bloom and our blossom to one another without judgment. May it be so. Blessed be and amen. As we head into this beautiful, humid, hot, beautiful late August day, let's take in the smiles of everyone we see. And those who aren't smiling, may we offer what is our best, trusting that wherever we are, with our feet firmly on the ground, in time we will grow and flower. Blessed be, and amen.